to me, poetry is the last kind of pure art, and in some ways I want it to have a small audience. So I might be a little slightly different from a lot of people in that as long as it's sort of this impassioned group of people who just love everything about the written language, that's enough for me.
On November 7, 2012, at LA's Ruskin Art Club, poets Dana Gioia and Victoria Chang read from their work. Then, as you'll see in this video, they took questions on the current state of poetry. Gioia is a former NEA chair and author of Pity the Beautiful. Chang is the author of Salvinia Molesta, and she is editor of the Anthology of Asian American Poetry.
Curiosities? Yes. Dana, are you more optimistic or pessimistic about the state of poetry today, or somewhere in between, or neither?
Well, I'm more optimistic. I mean, it sounds very odd. I'm more optimistic about the state of poetry than fiction or spoken theater. And it's because, poetry, you can just stand in a room and build it out. You don't need a publisher, you don't need a theater, you don't need a community in a sense. And it is the most ancient art, and we're sort of moving back into an oral culture. That being said, I think that if we lose fiction and theater, we lose civilization. Poetry has been a barbarous undertaking all. But I think that actually poetry is probably healthier than it was 20 years ago.
Why do you think live theater is in danger?
Because I looked at the numbers, and for the first time in calculated history, which is said the surveys have begun, now fewer than 10% of the U.S. population sees one spoken play, in a year's time. So it's almost, the audience has almost been cut in half over the last 20 years.
Do you think one of the problems with contemporary poetry is that the language itself is dead? In other words, we've become over-technologized. Behavior has become interpreted by psychology, and that in particular. And the corporate logo, the corporate speak and news speak and bureaucratic speak has intervened in so much with our natural relationship with the natural world. And do you think that's one of the difficulties, is that just language itself?
And everything you're saying is true. But, a healthy culture, that would be part of the target of poetry. The poetry would have all these things that as you did them, people would recognize you're cleaning the language.
I think Victoria did some of that. Actually.
Yeah, and so, so I think that's, Victoria, what do you think about that? Do you feel that that's something you're combating?
It's smart to toss it. Toss it, I don't know how I feel about, because every time I feel as if I'm going back to the earlier question, and every time I feel as if poetry is sort of irrelevant now, I'm proven otherwise, and so, I feel like the problem for me is that the biggest disconnect is, when I'm around poets and literary types and writers, it feels so lively, and I'm completely a different person. But then I go back to my regular life, and no one reads anymore. And they don't even read magazines or newspapers or anything. And so I feel torn about that, because to me, poetry is the last kind of pure art, and in some ways I want it to have a small audience. So I might be a little slightly different from a lot of people in that as long as it's sort of this impassioned group of people who just love everything about the written language, that's enough for me. But I'm very aware of what the Poetry Foundation has been trying to do for the last 5 or 10 years, ever since they had that large grant, and getting poetry on buses and trying to get poetry out there. But for me, I almost feel like it's maybe poetry is just for a small population, and that's okay for me. But I think for me, it's a very personal thing, and I might be very different in that regard.
And Dan was talking about writing for jazz, and you notice the old Cole Porter or the Gershwins or Irving Berlin, their lyrics fit so well because they were drawing from a language that had slang, because it was the Jewish generation that came from the old country. They reveled in American pizzazz and the speed of the language and everything, and the idioms. And I find that if you listen to pop music now, there's so little of that, it seems to me, and corresponding to poetry. I mean, I'm just making it
Well,
very
the thing is that, let me say, I have some students, some of my students are in the audience, and I have said that coming and teaching but I think it's a great university. I think USC is a great university, and they have tremendously qualified students. I'm astonished at how small the vocabulary has become, how small their historical range of association has become, how small their mythic kitty has grown, and it's been replaced by brand names, by slogans, and things like this, which is essentially corporate-owned speech. And I worry that too much of people's brains today are actually owned by people with TM and circle R after words. And so I think that a poet is laboring under a great disability, because there's less and less that you can do, in terms of just summoning up, the things that you want to as well, tying things together across ages and things like that. But the fact is, every age is crappy. And the artists in an age have got to deal with with the issues, and we'll see where it goes. But I do think that there's a real battle about language itself right now, and I think corporate ownership. And I say this as somebody who's a free market person. I think corporate ownership of language and the way that some of the best minds in the country are just trying to lodge these names and these slogans in people's minds quite successfully. Becomes a cumulative issue over time.
And some of what you're saying, or maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, or some of what you're saying is that in some ways poetry, the language of poetry has become somewhat out of touch with the current landscape of whatever it is that we live in. And I think the question is, does poetry have that mission to be in touch with the current society, and what should poetry's mission be? And for me, I don't have easy answers to that question, but many have argued that poetry's existence in the academic sort of environment has made it more, the ivory tower has made it more sort of out of touch with the rest of the population. And there is an argument for that, I think. And so I think those are much larger issues.
But I worry that an art that's written only for other artists in the same discipline becomes decadent almost immediately.
I have one question over here first, sorry.
Yeah, that was a great conversation. So, Dana, I hear you on the spiritual impoverishment of my generation, though I know that's a sterile word that you might not choose.
I don't think it's your generation, I think it's total. I think my generation is probably worse.
Oh, you think your generation is worse? Interesting, okay. But for those people who are hungry for death or anesthetized, what do you think that the artist can do in order to reach them? In respect to, I know that you think a lot about Eliot's objective correlative, but I mean the thing is that oftentimes I find it so idiosyncratic about how people find that death. So do you think that there is one way?
No, not the least. I think if you I recently reread Dostoevsky's The Idiot, and just the spiritual intensity of that work, just moment by moment, is extraordinary. And what seems to be at stake in that work is so extraordinary. And that's what it seems like if you're always gambling at the dollar table, it's not going to be very interesting. And I think go after the cosmic stakes. Go after eternity. It's good. I wrote a piece on John Donne about a year ago, and just reading Donne, the struggle. I mean, both the erotic poetry and the religious poetry is of a piece.
Yeah.
This is just an ambitious kind of imagination. And I think that's that kind of energy. I mean, people respond to it in films. I mean, people, there'll be a film that sort of engages us, and even though the film isn't perfect, they're responding because at least something seems to be, doors seem to be opening.